On a cold morning in November 1996 in the hills of rural Tennessee, a young woman named Patricia Anne Morrison vanished from her family's farmhouse without a trace. She was 23 years old, a mother of 2 small children, and by all accounts, she had no reason to disappear. Her car sat in the driveway. Her purse remained on the kitchen counter. Her children woke that morning to find their mother simply gone, as if she had evaporated into the autumn air. The man who reported her missing was her husband of 5 years, James Robert Morrison, a soft-spoken mechanic who worked at the tire shop in town. He told deputies his wife had been there when he went to bed and gone when he woke. For 27 years, that story would stand unchallenged, a mystery that haunted a small community and left 2 children growing up without answers. But in the winter of 2023, one of those children, now an adult, would finally speak the words that would shatter the silence and bring the truth crawling out of the darkness. How does a person vanish from a locked house in the middle of the night? And how does the truth stay buried for nearly 3 decades? Hawkins County sits in the northeastern corner of Tennessee, pressed against the Virginia border like a hand cupped around a secret. In 1996, it was timber country and farmland, a place where families had worked the same plots of earth for generations, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The town of Rogersville, the county seat, had a population of just over 4,000 people. Main Street ran 8 blocks long, with a courthouse at one end and a feed store at the other. The Morrison family lived 7 miles outside town, down a winding 2-lane road that cut through stands of oak and hickory, their farmhouse set back from the highway on 12 acres that James Morrison's grandfather had purchased in 1952. Patricia Anne Morrison, born Patricia Ann Caldwell, had grown up in Kingsport, about 30 miles away. She met James at a church potluck when she was 17 and he was 21. Those who knew her then described her as quiet, with long dark hair she wore in a braid down her back and a shy smile that appeared only when she felt comfortable. She had worked as a cashier at the grocery store before the children were born. Her daughter, Emily, was 4 years old in November 1996. Her son, Daniel, was 2. The family attended Sunday services at Bethel Baptist Church, where Patricia sang in the choir and James served as a deacon. To the outside world, they appeared unremarkable, a young family making their way through the ordinary struggles of rural life. The farmhouse itself was a simple structure, white clapboard with green shutters, 2 stories with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern side. A gravel driveway curved up from the road, ending in a turnaround beside a detached garage where James kept his tools and worked on vehicles in his spare time. Behind the house, the property sloped down toward a creek that ran year-round, its banks thick with kudzu and wild blackberry. November in eastern Tennessee brings a particular kind of cold, the damp chill that seeps through walls and settles in bones. And that year the leaves had fallen early, carpeting the ground in rust and gold. Clear's throat. On the evening of November 14, 1996, a Thursday, the Morrison family followed their usual routine. James came home from the tire shop at 6:15, his work boots leaving tracks of red clay across the kitchen linoleum. Patricia had made meatloaf and mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden that she had canned in August. Emily and Daniel sat at the small table in the kitchen, Daniel in his high chair, Emily swinging her legs against the chair rungs. After dinner, Patricia bathed the children while James watched the news in the living room. By 8 o'clock, both children were in bed, Emily in her room at the top of the stairs, Daniel in the nursery across the hall. Patricia folded laundry in the bedroom she shared with James. He said later that they watched television until around 10:30, then turned off the lights and went to sleep. The details of that ordinary evening would become critical later, each mundane action examined and re-examined, held up to the light and turned over like a stone that might reveal something hidden underneath. What time exactly did James come home? Did anyone see his truck on the road? What did Patricia say during dinner? Did she seem worried, distracted, afraid? The neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived a quarter-mile down the road, reported hearing nothing unusual that night. No screams, no sounds of struggle, no vehicles coming or going on the gravel drive. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees. A light rain began falling around midnight and continued until dawn. James Morrison called the Hawkins County Sheriff's Department at 7:43 on the morning of November 15th. The recording of that call, preserved in the case file, captures a man who sounds confused rather than panicked. His voice is flat, almost monotone. "I need to report my wife missing," he said. "I woke up and she wasn't here. Her car is still here, but she's gone." The dispatcher asked standard questions. How long had she been missing? Had they argued? Did she have family or friends she might have gone to visit? James answered each question with variations of "I don't know." He said they had not argued. He said Patricia's family lived in Kingsport, but she wouldn't have walked there in the middle of the night. He said her purse was on the counter with her wallet and identification still inside. The dispatcher told him to stay at the house. Deputies were on their way. Deputy Carl Whittaker arrived at the Morrison farmhouse at 8:07 that morning. He was a 20-year veteran of the sheriff's department, a man who had worked dozens of missing person cases, most of which ended with someone found drunk in a barn or shacked up with a lover in the next county. He expected this call would resolve itself by lunchtime. Instead, it would become the case that haunted him for the rest of his career. Deputy Whittaker found James Morrison standing on the front porch, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. The children were inside, Emily watching cartoons on the television, Daniel sitting on the floor playing with wooden blocks. Deputy Whittaker would later write in his report that the house appeared orderly and undisturbed. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. The back door was locked from the inside. The front door had been unlocked, James explained, because he never locked it when he was home. Patricia's purse sat on the kitchen counter, a brown leather bag with a broken zipper. Inside was her wallet containing $43 in cash and her driver's license with a photograph showing her unsmiling face and dark eyes. Her hairbrush lay on the bathroom counter. Her toothbrush stood in the holder beside the sink. A load of laundry sat damp in the washing machine, forgotten, as if she had intended to move it to the dryer but had been interrupted. Her wedding ring, however, was missing. James told Deputy Whittaker that Patricia always wore her ring, a simple gold band, never took it off, not even to wash dishes. Deputy Whittaker made a note of this detail but did not yet understand its significance. By 9 o'clock, more deputies had arrived. They walked the property in a grid pattern, searching the barn, the garage, the woods beyond the house. They found nothing. No footprints in the soft earth around the house, though the rain had likely washed away any tracks that might have been there. No blood, no torn clothing, no indication of struggle. Patricia Morrison had simply vanished, as completely as if she had never existed. The swing set in the backyard, a rusted metal frame with 2 swings and a slide, sat empty and still. A red plastic tricycle lay on its side near the porch steps. These details, captured in the crime scene photographs, would become symbols of absence, of a mother who had left behind her children and her life without explanation. The search expanded throughout the day. Volunteers from the community arrived, men in hunting jackets and women carrying thermoses of coffee, all of them wanting to help find Patricia Morrison. They formed lines and walked through the woods, calling her name. They searched the creek bed, the abandoned barns on neighboring properties, the old logging roads that crisscrossed the county. The temperature climbed into the low 50s. The clouds broke apart and weak sunlight filtered through the bare trees. By late afternoon, more than 100 people were searching, and they had found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a shoe, not a single clue as to where Patricia Morrison had gone or what had happened to her. Part 2. The investigation. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Department established a command post in the parking lot of Bethel Baptist Church, 2 miles from the Morrison farm. By the evening of November 15th, search teams had covered an area of approximately 15 square miles. Bloodhounds brought in from Kingsport picked up Patricia's scent at the farmhouse but lost it at the end of the driveway, where the gravel met the asphalt road. This suggested to investigators that Patricia had left the property in a vehicle, either her own or someone else's. But her car, a 1989 Honda Accord, remained parked beside the house, and no one reported seeing any unfamiliar vehicles in the area that night. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a weathered man in his late 50s who had held the position for 12 years, held a press conference on the afternoon of November 16th. He stood before a cluster of microphones, television cameras from Knoxville and Bristol recording his words. Patricia's photograph, the same image from her driver's license, appeared on the evening news across eastern Tennessee. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, approximately 120 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. Last seen wearing a white nightgown. Sheriff Brennan asked anyone with information to contact the department immediately. He said the investigation was ongoing and that all possibilities were being considered. He did not say that investigators were already beginning to focus their attention on James Morrison. Those who knew James described him as a man of few words, someone who kept to himself and rarely showed emotion. At the tire shop where he worked, his coworkers said he was reliable and competent but never socialized, never joined them for drinks after work, never talked about his personal life. He had worked at the shop for 7 years, arriving at 7 each morning and leaving at 5 each afternoon. His time cards showed no absences in the month before Patricia's disappearance. His supervisor, a man named Donald Creek, told investigators that James had seemed normal in the days leading up to November 15th, neither particularly happy nor particularly troubled. But now, watching James Morrison during the search efforts, some of those same people began to notice things that struck them as odd. He did not cry. He did not appear frantic or desperate. When volunteers gathered at the church to organize search parties, James stood apart from the groups, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression blank. Patricia's mother, Helen Caldwell, drove from Kingsport the day after her daughter's disappearance. She collapsed in the driveway of the farmhouse, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. James stood on the porch and watched her, his face showing nothing. Helen would later tell investigators that she had never trusted her son-in-law, that there was something cold about him, something not quite right. But she had kept her doubts to herself because Patricia had seemed happy, or at least had never complained. Deputies began conducting formal interviews on the 3rd day of the investigation. They talked to family members, friends, church members, neighbors, anyone who might have information about Patricia's state of mind or her relationship with her husband. A picture began to emerge, though it was fragmentary and contradictory. Some people said the marriage seemed stable. Others said they had noticed tension between James and Patricia in recent months, though they could not point to specific incidents. A woman from the church, Margaret Ellis, mentioned that Patricia had seemed withdrawn during choir practice in late October, that she had been quieter than usual, and had left immediately after practice instead of staying to socialize. Another church member recalled seeing what might have been a bruise on Patricia's upper arm in September, though she could not be certain. Clear's throat. The timeline became a central focus. James said he had gone to bed at 10:30 on November 14th and had not woken until his alarm went off at 6:15 the next morning. He said Patricia had been in bed beside him when he fell asleep and gone when he woke. But several details did not align with this account. The sheets on Patricia's side of the bed appeared undisturbed, tucked in tight as if they had not been slept in. The pillow showed no indentation. James explained that Patricia had always made the bed first thing each morning, but if she had made the bed that morning, where had she gone afterward? And why would she make the bed before leaving the house in the middle of the night, wearing only a nightgown in near-freezing temperatures? The more investigators looked, the more inconsistencies they found. James said he had not heard anything unusual during the night, no doors opening, no sounds of movement. But the front door, the only door that had been unlocked, opened directly into the living room, just steps from the bedroom where James slept. The door had a tendency to squeak, neighbors confirmed, a high-pitched sound that could be heard throughout the house. How had Patricia opened that door without waking her husband? And why had she left without taking her purse, her money, her identification? Why had she left her children? Physical evidence was scarce. Forensic technicians processed the house, dusting for fingerprints, searching for any indication of what had happened. They found Patricia's fingerprints throughout the house, in all the expected places, the kitchen, the bathroom, the children's rooms. They found James's fingerprints as well. They found no evidence of an intruder. No foreign fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone outside the family had been in the house that night. The bedroom showed no evidence of struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken objects, nothing to suggest violence had occurred there. But in the garage, deputies noticed something that struck them as peculiar. James's truck, a 1992 Ford F-150, sat parked in its usual spot. The truck was clean, unusually clean for a vehicle belonging to a mechanic who worked in a tire shop. The interior had been vacuumed recently. The bed of the truck had been hosed out. When questioned about this, James said he had cleaned the truck the previous weekend because he had hauled a load of mulch and wanted to remove the debris. Deputies noted the explanation but remained skeptical. They measured the odometer reading and compared it to the reading James had recorded in a maintenance log he kept in the glove compartment. The log showed the truck had approximately 231,000 miles on November 10th. The odometer now showed 231,112 miles. The truck had been driven 112 miles in the 4 days between November 10th and November 14th. James said he had driven to and from work, approximately 30 miles round trip, each of those 4 days. That accounted for 120 miles, 8 miles more than the odometer showed. The discrepancy was noted but not conclusive. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about James Morrison's behavior. He had not asked to join the search parties. He had not distributed flyers or made public appeals for information. He had not broken down or shown visible grief. He had simply waited at the farmhouse, caring for his children, answering questions when asked, volunteering nothing. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that cold finger of suspicion tracing down your spine even as you try to push it away, the investigators understood that feeling as they watched James Morrison sit calmly in his living room while dozens of people searched desperately for his wife. On November 20th, 5 days after Patricia's disappearance, Sheriff Brennan made the decision to bring James Morrison in for a formal interview at the sheriff's department. James agreed to come voluntarily. He arrived at 9 o'clock that morning, driving his truck, wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn the day Patricia vanished. He sat across from Detective Linda Hayes in a small interview room with cinder block walls painted institutional beige. The interview was recorded on videotape. Detective Hayes, A woman in her early 40s who had worked in investigations for 10 years began with gentle questions, establishing rapport, going over the timeline again. James's answers remained consistent with what he had said before. He had gone to bed at 10:30. Patricia had been there. He had woken at 6:15. She was gone. "Did you argue that night?" Detective Hayes asked. "No." "Had you argued recently, in the days or weeks before she disappeared?" "No more than usual." "What does that mean, no more than usual?" "Just the normal things. Money sometimes, the kids." "Did Patricia seem unhappy?" "I don't know, she didn't say she was." "Did she ever talk about leaving?" "No." Detective Hayes leaned forward slightly. "James, I need to ask you directly. Did you do something to Patricia?" James Morrison looked directly at the detective. His expression did not change. "No," he said, "I didn't." The interview continued for 3 hours. Detective Hayes pressed harder, returning to inconsistencies, asking why James had not seemed more distressed, why he had not participated more actively in the search. James's answers remained flat, almost mechanical. He said he was in shock. He said he didn't know what to feel. He said he was trying to hold himself together for the children. When the interview ended, James was free to leave. There was not enough evidence to hold him, not enough even to establish that a crime had been committed. Patricia Morrison could have left voluntarily. People did that sometimes, walked away from their lives without explanation. But Detective Hayes did not believe that. Neither did Sheriff Brennan. Neither did most of the investigators working the case. The search continued for 2 more weeks, but the intensity diminished as days passed without any new leads. Volunteers returned to their regular lives. Television crews packed up their equipment and moved on to other stories. By early December, the active search had ended, though the case remained open. Patricia Morrison's photograph was entered into national databases for missing persons. Her family posted flyers in truck stops and rest areas across the Southeast. But as winter settled over Hawkins County, as snow dusted the hills and ice formed in the creek behind the Morrison farmhouse, the investigation slowed to a crawl and then stopped altogether. Patricia Morrison had vanished, and no one could prove what had happened to her. Part 3: The Silence. 18 months after Patricia Morrison disappeared, in May 1998, James Morrison sold the farmhouse and moved with his children to Kentucky, 200 miles west, to a small town called Harlan in the Appalachian coal country. He told Patricia's family he needed a fresh start, that staying in the house where she had vanished was too painful. Helen Caldwell begged him not to take the children so far away, but legally she had no recourse. James was their father, and no charges had been filed against him. The move severed the last remaining connections to Patricia's family. Helen would see her grandchildren only twice more in the next 25 years, brief visits that James supervised closely, during which the children seemed quiet and withdrawn. In Harlan, James found work at an auto repair shop. He rented a small house on the edge of town, a place with peeling paint and a yard overgrown with weeds. Emily started kindergarten that fall. Daniel would start preschool the following year. To their new neighbors and Emily's teachers, the Morrison family appeared to be managing, though there was an atmosphere of sadness that hung over them like smoke. James did not talk about his wife. When asked, he said only that she was gone. People in small towns understand that some stories are too painful to share, so they did not press for details. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the weight of unspoken knowledge pressing down on you, Emily Morrison carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. She had been 4 years old when her mother disappeared, old enough to remember, old enough to understand more than anyone realized. In the years that followed, she had nightmares, vivid dreams from which she woke screaming. She drew pictures in school that troubled her teachers, dark scribbles in black and red crayon showing figures that might have been people but were distorted and frightening. When a school counselor asked about the drawings, Emily would not explain them. She said only that she had bad dreams sometimes. Daniel remembered less. He had been 2 when their mother vanished, too young to hold clear memories. But children absorb trauma even when they cannot articulate it, and Daniel grew into a watchful, anxious child who startled easily and rarely smiled. He stayed close to his sister, following her from room to room, as if afraid to be alone. At night, Emily would hear him crying in his bedroom, and she would go to him and sit beside his bed until he fell asleep. She was 8 years old, 9, 10, becoming the mother their own mother could no longer be. James Morrison remarried in 2002. The woman was named Sandra, a widow he had met at a diner where she worked as a waitress. She moved into the house with her own daughter from her first marriage, a girl named Brittany who was Daniel's age. For a brief time, life in the Morrison household seemed almost normal. Sandra cooked dinner each evening. She made sure the children did their homework. She tried to create routines and stability, but she noticed things that disturbed her. James was distant, emotionally absent, a man who went through the motions of family life without genuine engagement. He rarely spoke at dinner. He spent his evenings in the garage, working on cars, avoiding interaction. And there was something about the way James acted around Emily. He watched her constantly, a surveillance that felt oppressive and controlling. When Emily tried to spend time with friends, James found reasons she could not go. When she talked on the phone, he listened from the next room. When she asked questions about her mother, he shut down the conversation immediately. "Your mother left," he would say. "That's all you need to know." But Emily had not forgotten. The memories lived in her mind like photographs, and one memory in particular, one image, refused to fade no matter how many years passed. The marriage between James and Sandra lasted less than 3 years. Sandra left in 2005, taking Brittany with her. She would tell a friend later that she could not stand living in that house anymore, that there was something wrong there, something dark she could not name. She said James frightened her, not because he was violent but because he was hollow, a man with nothing inside him. After Sandra left, James and his children returned to the pattern they had established before, a household of silence and avoidance, each person trapped in their own isolation. Emily turned 18 in 2010. She graduated from high school and immediately left Harlan, moving to Lexington to attend community college. She worked 2 jobs to support herself, refusing any financial help from her father. She changed her name legally from Emily Morrison to Emily Caldwell, taking her mother's maiden name. She did not tell James she was doing this. For those who have ever tried to escape a truth that follows you like a shadow, Emily understood that changing her name would not erase the past, but it was a start, a way of claiming an identity separate from the man who had raised her. Daniel stayed in Harlan after finishing high school. He worked at a warehouse, loading trucks, a job that required physical effort but no emotional engagement. He lived in a small apartment above a hardware store. He rarely spoke to his father, though they lived in the same town. The distance between them was a silence that had calcified over years, a barrier neither of them attempted to cross. But Daniel, like Emily, carried memories, fragments, and impressions from that night in November 1996, images that surfaced in dreams and in moments of unguarded thought. The years accumulated. 2010 became 2015, became 2020. Patricia Morrison had been gone for 24 years, a quarter of a century, longer than she had been alive. In Kingsport, Helen Caldwell grew old, her health failing, her heart still broken. She kept a photograph of Patricia on her mantle, a picture taken at Patricia's high school graduation, a young woman smiling with her whole future ahead of her. Helen had never stopped believing that James Morrison had taken that future away, but she had no proof, only a mother's certainty, and certainty alone was not enough to bring justice. Then, in November 2022, on the 26th anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, Emily Caldwell sat in her apartment in Lexington and made a decision. She was 30 years old. She had spent more than half her life running from the truth, burying it, trying to build a life on top of it. But the foundation was cracked, and everything she tried to build kept crumbling. For those who have ever reached the point where the weight of a secret becomes unbearable, where the cost of silence outweighs the cost of speaking, Emily understood that she could not carry this burden any longer. She picked up her phone and called the Hawkins County Sheriff's Department in Tennessee. She told the deputy who answered that she had information about a cold case, a missing person case from 1996. She gave her name. She said she was the daughter of Patricia Morrison. And then she said the words that would finally break the case open. "I need to tell you what I saw that night." Part 4. The Revelation. Detective Ryan Foster had been with the Hawkins County Sheriff's Department for 8 years when Emily Caldwell's call came in on November 10, 2022. He was 34 years old, young enough to have been a child himself when Patricia Morrison disappeared, too young to remember the case firsthand. But every cold case detective inherits the ghosts of their predecessors, and Detective Foster had read the Morrison file multiple times, had studied the photographs and reports and witness statements, had felt the same frustration the original investigators must have felt when the trail went cold. Emily agreed to come to Tennessee to give a formal statement. On November 18, 2022, she walked into the sheriff's department, a woman with her mother's dark hair and her mother's brown eyes, carrying the weight of 26 years of silence. Detective Foster met with her in the same interview room where her father had been questioned in 1996, though Emily did not know this. The interview was recorded, both audio and video. Detective Foster began gently, thanking Emily for coming forward, assuring her that she could take as much time as she needed. Then he asked her to tell him what she remembered about the night her mother disappeared. Emily took a breath. Her hands were shaking. She said, "I was 4 years old, almost 5. I remember waking up because I heard voices. My parents were arguing. My mother was crying. I got out of bed and went to the top of the stairs. I could see into the living room. My father was standing there and my mother was on the floor. She was trying to crawl away from him. He grabbed her by her hair and dragged her toward the door. She was trying to fight him, but she couldn't. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make any sound. He opened the door and dragged her outside. I ran back to my room and hid under my bed. I stayed there until morning." The words hung in the air. Detective Foster asked follow-up questions, methodically building a timeline, establishing details. What time had Emily woken up? She thought it might have been late, maybe midnight or after, but she could not be certain. What had her parents been arguing about? She could not remember the words, only the tone, her mother's voice pleading, her father's voice cold and hard. Had Emily told anyone about this at the time? No, she had been too frightened. And later, as years passed, she had convinced herself it must have been a nightmare, that it could not have been real. But she had never forgotten the image of her father dragging her mother across the floor, her mother's face turned toward the stairs, toward Emily watching from the darkness. "Why are you coming forward now?" Detective Foster asked. Emily's voice was quiet. "Because I can't live with it anymore, and because I know it was real. It wasn't a dream. He took her out of that house that night and he never brought her back." Detective Foster contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The case was officially reopened on December 1, 2022. Investigators began the painstaking process of re-examining all the evidence, reviewing witness statements, searching for anything that might have been missed 26 years earlier. They looked again at James Morrison's truck, the odometer discrepancy, the fact that the vehicle had been unusually clean. They considered possible locations where James might have disposed of Patricia's body. The terrain around Hawkins County offered countless possibilities: dense forests, abandoned mines, deep ravines where a body could lie undiscovered for decades. In January 2023, investigators decided to bring Daniel Morrison in for an interview. He had been only 2 years old at the time of his mother's disappearance, and no one had seriously considered that he might have usable memories from that night. But recent research in developmental psychology suggested that traumatic memories could sometimes be retained even from very early childhood, especially if the trauma was severe. Daniel agreed to speak with investigators. He met with Detective Foster and a forensic psychologist in a victim advocacy center in Lexington. Daniel's memories were fragmentary, impressions rather than clear images, but he remembered being frightened that night. He remembered crying in his crib. He remembered his father coming into his room, picking him up, holding him roughly, telling him to be quiet. And he remembered, though he was not certain of this, a smell, something chemical and sharp, like the cleaning products his father used in the garage. These memories, combined with Emily's account, began to form a coherent narrative of what might have happened in the Morrison farmhouse on the night of November 14, 1996. Clears throat. On February 23, 2023, investigators obtained a search warrant for properties currently owned by James Morrison. He was still living in Harlan, Kentucky, in a different house than the one he had rented when he first moved there, a property he had purchased in 2015. The search team included cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment. They also obtained a warrant to search the site of the former Morrison farmhouse in Tennessee. The property had changed hands twice since James sold it, and the current owners had built a new garage and expanded the house, but the original footprint remained. The search of the Harlan property yielded nothing significant, but at the Tennessee property, cadaver dogs alerted in the area behind the old barn, near where the creek ran through the bottomland. Ground-penetrating radar showed a disturbance in the soil, an area where the earth had been dug and refilled, the layers inconsistent with the surrounding geology. On March 3, 2023, excavation began. Investigators dug carefully, sifting through layers of soil and clay. At a depth of approximately 4 feet, they found human remains, skeletal but identifiable, wrapped in what appeared to be plastic sheeting that had partially decomposed. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office in Nashville. Forensic analysis confirmed that they were the remains of a female, aged between 20 and 30 at time of death, height and build consistent with Patricia Morrison's description. Dental records provided definitive identification. The remains were those of Patricia Anne Morrison, missing for 26 years, buried less than 300 yards from the house where she had lived and died. The medical examiner determined cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the skull, likely from repeated impacts with a heavy object. Fracture patterns suggested the victim had been struck at least 5 times. The hyoid bone in the neck showed evidence of fracture, consistent with strangulation, though the medical examiner could not determine whether strangulation had occurred before or after the blunt force trauma. What was clear was that Patricia Morrison had not died quickly or easily, and that her death had been violent and intentional. On March 15, 2023, James Robert Morrison was arrested at his home in Harlan, Kentucky. He was charged with second-degree homicide and abuse of a corpse. Kentucky State Police transported him back to Tennessee to face charges in Hawkins County. Video footage of the arrest shows James Morrison standing on his front porch as officers approached, his expression the same blank mask he had worn 26 years earlier when deputies came to tell him his wife was missing. He did not resist. He said nothing. He was placed in handcuffs and led to a patrol car while neighbors stood in their yards watching, a man finally being held accountable for a crime that had haunted a community for more than a quarter century. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. National news outlets picked up the story. The case became a symbol of persistence, of justice delayed but not denied, of a daughter's courage in finally speaking the truth that had been silenced for so long. In Kingsport, Helen Caldwell, now 82 years old and frail, wept when investigators called to tell her they had found her daughter. She said she had always known Patricia had not simply walked away. She said she had prayed for this day, though she had almost stopped believing it would come. The community of Rogersville reacted with a mixture of shock and vindication. Those who had suspected James Morrison from the beginning felt their instincts confirmed. Others, who had maintained that he must be innocent because nothing had been proven, struggled to reconcile their earlier certainty with this new reality. Margaret Ellis, the church member who had noticed Patricia seemed withdrawn in the weeks before she disappeared, told a reporter, "I think we all knew, deep down. We just didn't want to believe it. It's easier to believe someone ran away than to believe someone you know could do something so terrible." James Morrison's attorney entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. The trial was scheduled for November 2023, 27 years almost to the day after Patricia's death. But in September 2023, facing overwhelming evidence including Emily's testimony, Daniel's corroborating memories, and the forensic evidence from Patricia's remains, James Morrison accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to second-degree homicide in exchange for a sentence of 40 years in prison without possibility of parole. He was 52 years old. Even with good behavior, he would likely die in prison. At the sentencing hearing on October 6, 2023, Emily Caldwell read a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium facing the man who had raised her, the man who had taken away her mother, and she spoke in a clear, steady voice. "You stole my mother from me," she said. "You stole my childhood. You made me doubt my own memories, my own reality. You turned our home into a tomb, but you didn't break me. I survived you, and I'm here to make sure the truth is finally told." My mother's name was Patricia Anne Morrison. She was 23 years old. She was a mother, a daughter, a person who deserved to live. You took that from her, but you can't take her memory. We will remember her, and we will make sure she is never forgotten. James Morrison showed no reaction to his daughter's words. He stared straight ahead, his face as blank as it had been that morning in November 1996 when deputies arrived to find his wife gone. When given the opportunity to speak, he declined. He was led from the courtroom without ever acknowledging what he had done, without ever expressing remorse. A man who had spent 27 years hiding behind silence and would now spend the rest of his life in prison. Patricia Morrison's remains were released to her family in November 2023. A funeral service was held at Bethel Baptist Church, the same church where she had sung in the choir, where her children had been baptized, where James had served as a deacon while his wife's body lay buried in the ground. The church was filled beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles and spilled out into the parking lot. Helen Caldwell sat in the front pew between her granddaughter and grandson, 3 generations bound by loss and finally, imperfectly, by justice. Patricia was buried beside her father in a cemetery overlooking the valley, a place where the mountains rise blue against the sky and the wind moves through the trees like breath. Closing. The case of Patricia Morrison represents both the failure and the eventual triumph of the justice system, a reminder that truth can remain buried but not forever, that silence can be enforced but not maintained indefinitely. For 26 years, a community lived with unanswered questions, and 2 children grew up in the shadow of a lie. The resolution brought no resurrection, no restoration of what was lost, only the cold comfort of knowing what happened and seeing accountability, however delayed, finally imposed. Emily and Daniel Caldwell, having reclaimed their mother's name, continue to rebuild their lives, carrying the complicated legacy of being both victims and witnesses, children who survived what their mother could not. They have each other, and they have their grandmother, and they have the memory of a young woman who deserved better than the fate that found her in a farmhouse in Tennessee on a cold November night. Patricia Anne Morrison was 23 years old when she died. She had lived through 23 years of ordinary joys and sorrows, had married and given birth and sung in a church choir and made meatloaf for dinner and folded laundry. She was real, a person with thoughts and dreams and fears, not just a victim in a case file. Her life mattered. Her absence mattered. And now, finally, the truth of what happened to her has been told. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.